Tonight's scripture reading is from John chapter 9, verses 39 through 41. Again, John chapter 9, verses 39 through 41. And Jesus said, "For judgment I am come into this world, that they which see not might see, and that they which see might be made blind." And some of the Pharisees which were with him heard these words, and said unto him, "Are we blind also?" Jesus said unto them, "If ye were blind, ye should have no sin. But now ye say, We see, therefore your sin remaineth."
Thank you very much. Matthew chapter 13, Jesus tells a parable of the soils. And we often think about that verse whenever we are perhaps studying the scriptures with somebody, that we understand this fact that there are some people that whenever we take the gospel to people, that there are going to be those that have this fertile soil. That once we plant the seed in the heart of these people, that they are going to accept the gospel of Christ and are going to become followers of Jesus. And some of them very easily. And become great servants in the kingdom of God. But then there are also those that perhaps might obey the gospel, and then with some difficulty of life coming their way, they fall away from it. And we understand also that there are those who the gospel is preached to them and they will never accept it. And when we look at John chapter 9, we almost see this parable played out of different types of hearts, different types of soils of man's hearts, that once the gospel is preached to them, once the evidence of who Jesus is presented to them, that there are those that accept it, that there are those who are too fearful for it, and there are those who will blindly deny it. And I want us to think about this from this morning whenever we were talking about this directive that was given to Timothy of the need to preach the gospel of Christ. Right? To be people who, as Christians, that we are not to be ashamed of the gospel of Christ, that we are to be like Timothy and go out into the world and to share the gospel with anybody and everybody that we come in contact with. And as we do that, there might be different types of people that we encounter that we can often get discouraged, or maybe different people that we encounter that we can see the gospel growing within their heart. When we consider John chapter 9 tonight, you notice what just happens to Jesus. At the very end of John chapter 8, we see Jesus really telling the crowds that had gathered there, these Jews that are there, that He is the Messiah. Right, at the very end of chapter 8, Jesus makes that statement in verse 58 that before Abraham was, I am. And those that were there in the crowds, they understood the implication of that statement. Thinking back to God and His talking to Moses at the burning bush, I am that I am. They understood at that moment when Jesus made that statement that before Abraham was, that I am, that He was claiming eternality, that He was claiming deity. And because of that, verse 59, they took up stones to stone Him, but Jesus hid Himself and went out of the temple, going through the midst of them, and so passed by. I don't know how that happened. Right? These people were so angry that Jesus would make this statement that they are trying and wanting to kill Him. And somehow He passes by. And then in John chapter 9, now as Jesus passed by. I don't know how I would feel about people who are trying to kill me, but I would imagine my reaction to this would be completely different than Jesus's. Not too long before John chapter 9 and verse 1 opens up, we see Jesus is about to be murdered, but yet in John chapter 9 and verse 1, Jesus passes by and he sees a man who was born blind from birth. Jesus cool, calm, and collected, following attempted murder. Jesus was often reviled, but yet he was never ruffled. And notice what the disciples see. Jesus passes by this man who was born blind, and his disciples look at this man and they ask Jesus, saying, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" I find that interesting. As you go through the book of John, we see miracles performed time and time again, right? We think about the first miracle of Cana of Galilee, where Jesus turned water into wine. His disciples there and witnessed that miracle that is happening in John chapter 2. We see very soon after that the nobleman's son who was sick with really a fatal fever in John chapter 4, and Jesus healing his son. We see the lame man who was told to take up his bed and walk in John chapter 5, and he did just that. He got up, picked up his bed, and leaped. We see the feeding of the 5,000 and the walking of Jesus on water in John chapter 6. And his disciples walking by with Jesus here in John chapter 9, they see this blind man. And what we don't see is an appeal to mercy. Right? There is no question from the disciples saying, "Hey Jesus, right, there is this man who is blind here, can we help him?" They have questions. They have questions and they want answers from their teacher. They want answers from their rabbi, and almost maybe selfishly they're desiring clarification from some rabbinical teaching. There's this man who's blind. Why is he blind? Is he blind because he committed some sin? Well, that's kind of an odd question. If he was born blind, how did something like that happen to him for him to be born blind? And we see, if you go back to Leviticus chapter 20, you see perhaps an idea that because of sexual sin that one could be born with some kind of defect, some kind of consequence because of sin. And we understand that fact, right? We understand that things can happen because of things that I do that can cause somebody else to have a defect in birth. Right? We understand the use of alcohol and drugs can affect a pregnancy. We understand that. And so they're asking Jesus, who sinned? And so we understand, perhaps if it was his parents that sinned, did they do something that caused this man to be the way he is? But the other part of this is what's difficult to understand. Or did this man sin? How would this man have sinned and caused himself to be blind? And very interesting, there's a couple different ideas that were taught through the Jews, and it is extra biblical teaching. It isn't something that we see throughout Scripture itself, but it's some oral teachings that were going through different sects of the Jews. And some of them believed at the time that in pre-existent souls, that each living person had a soul who existed beforehand, and those pre-existent souls could have sinned before taking on the form of human during birth. And so perhaps this man had sinned in a pre-existent condition. Some of the Jews also believed at the time in reincarnation. That perhaps this man sinned in a previous life, and so when he was reincarnated and born this time, then there's consequences for the sins that he committed in his previous life. Some of the Jews also taught that a baby could sin in the womb. I don't know what kind of sin a baby could commit in the womb. Perhaps maybe some horrible thought. I don't know. There was another thought that a consequence could have happened to somebody who was born with some issue because of a later sin that they might commit in the future. So this man was born blind because in the future he might commit some atrocious sin. And so being born blind would stop that from happening. So those are some teachings that are going on within the realm of Judaism, and for these disciples to ask Jesus this question: was this man born this way because of some sin he committed, or because of something that his parents did? And we see Jesus' response. The answer is none of the above. Right? It wasn't anything that this man did, and it wasn't anything that his parents did, but so that they and other people could witness the power of God. Jesus answered, verses 3 through 5, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day, for night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." And then when he had said these things, he spat on the ground and he made clay with the saliva, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay. And he said to him, "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam," which is translated sent. And so he went, washed, and he came back seeing. So I want us to, as we go through this chapter of John chapter 9, we really kind of notice three different men. All three, I think in one sense or another, blind. This first one we see very literally, he is blind. He is one who is born blind, but maybe he's blind from unfamiliarity. He's not familiar with who Jesus is. He can hear. He can talk. He can't see, but he can hear and he can talk. And so I am sure that as Jesus is coming to town, there is some commotion that is happening, that there is this man, and perhaps his notoriety of being a miracle worker is being talked about as Jesus is coming into town. That perhaps, hey, this was the man that the crowds of the Jews just recently tried to stone because of his claim that he is deity. That before Abraham was, I am. And he is coming into town. And so I would think, if I was born blind, that would be like that woman who had the issue of blood, seeking out for Jesus, seeking to have a healing so that I can see. But he doesn't do that. And so I wonder if this man had no idea who Jesus was. He was physically blind, but perhaps he was also blind, not knowing anything about Jesus, as Jesus was just able to pass by him. But you see, he had a good heart. He may have been blind with unfamiliarity, blind not knowing who Jesus was, but when Jesus made this clay and anointed the eyes of this man, and Jesus says, "Go and wash in the pool of Siloam," what does he do? He gets up and he goes. How did he get there? I hate to pick on my mom, but I'm going to. sometimes it's frustrating to lead somebody around who has difficulty seeing. They trip over things. They can't see anything, right? They're always bumping into something. But yet this man went. He's completely blind. He doesn't have difficulty seeing, but he cannot see anything at all. And Jesus says, go to the pool of Siloam. The pool of Siloam is in the area where Hezekiah had built his tunnel to be able to bring water up. And so you think about the terrain of him having to walk at least some stairs to go down to the pool in order to wash his eyes. So obviously he had to have some help get down there, but this was something that was difficult for him to do, and you kind of think a man who was born blind would probably think that this was a waste of time. This was a fool's errand. This isn't going to do anything. And the man put some mud on my eyes, and now he tells me to go wash them. I'm going to go do it. We see some faith in this man. Some faith in this man who may have not even known who Jesus was. And that's the sense of the idea as we continue to go through this. But he doesn't. He obeys Jesus. He obeys Jesus at his word. And as he comes from this pool, verse 7, he washes and comes back seeing. Did he know why he was going there? There's nothing that John records for us that Jesus ever told this blind man to go wash in the pool of Siloam so that you can receive sight. There's no promise of gaining sight at all, other than I put some mud and some spit on your eyes and go wash it off. And as he comes back, he sees. We think about this miracle, it's an instant miracle. This isn't something that he took some medicine and things improved and things got better. And over a time of years, over a time of exercise and therapy, he improved. But this is a miracle, a biblical miracle where it's an instant healing. He could see, he could come back and he could see like he's never seen before. To see everything. A complete healing. And this is the first time ever, from the time of Genesis until now to the book of John, that anybody has ever been healed of being born blind. There was never a prophet, there was never a priest, there was never a king who ever performed such a miracle to give sight to one who was born blind, but Jesus alone. This man was born blind. He may have been unfamiliar with Jesus, but he was honest. Later, he was questioned with how this happened. Verses 8 through 12. Therefore the neighbors saw this man who had been previously born blind, and they said, "Is this not the man who begged?" You wonder how that would strike people. You know who this man is. He sat and he begged for his survival, and everybody knew that he was blind, and now you see him up walking around. How did this happen? And so they asked him. Some people said, "This is he," and other people says, "Nah, he looks like him." But the man says, "I am him, I am he." Therefore they said to him, "How were your eyes opened?" And his answer, notice his answer, "A man." A man called Jesus made clay, verse 11, and anointed my eyes and said to me, "Go to the pool of Siloam and wash." And so I went and I washed and I received sight. There's humor in the Bible. And hopefully you catch the next sentence and the humorous statement that is made. They asked the man who was born blind, "Well, where is he?" Could he see him? Absolutely not. He was blind whenever the mud was put onto his eyes, and he was told to go wash in a pool. And then at that moment he was able to see, but he never saw the man who put the mud on his eyes. He just heard he was a man, his name was Jesus. And that seems to be all that he knew about him. He must have been just some man called Jesus and received his sight. He was a man who may have been unfamiliar with Jesus, but he was a man who was honest. A man who obeyed Jesus. And later, throughout this chapter, we see that he was a man who was wise too. John chapter 9, verse 30 through 33. After he's been questioned time and time again of how this happened, he makes this observation. The man answered and said to them, this is talking about the Pharisees that are questioning this blind man, "Why is this a marvelous thing that you don't know where he's from? Yet he's opened my eyes. Now we know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, he hears him. Since the world began, it has been unheard of that anyone opened the eyes of one who was born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." All right, so at the very beginning of this, we start seeing a progression of this man in his heart. He was blind and he was unfamiliar with who Jesus was, that whenever Jesus came to him, put the mud on his eyes, and he was asked how this happened, he says, "A man named Jesus." And then a little bit later, he's questioned of who Jesus was, and he says, well, he was a prophet. And now he says, he must be from God. He is teaching the Pharisees that he has to be from God in order to be able to do this thing. It's a very similar progression that we see with the woman at the Samaritan woman at the well. Right at the very beginning, whenever Jesus sits down at the well and begins talking to her, "How dare you, a man, sit and talk with me, a Samaritan woman?" And then she says from there, a Jew, and then from there, a prophet. And then from there, she asks the question, "Are you the Christ?" And she goes back home and tells all the people of this man, Jesus, who told her all the things that she has done, even from childhood. This man has the same progression. A man who was born blind, but a man who was blind because of his unfamiliarity with Christ, comes to understand that Jesus is more than just a man. He is more than just a prophet. That he is the Son of God. But then we have some more blind people in his story. Not just him. Even the story is really kind of focused on him. We come across two more people that are blind. Verse 18 through 22. The Jews did not believe concerning him, the blind man, that he had been blind and received his sight, until they called the parents of him who had received his sight. And they asked them, saying, "Is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he see?" His parents answered them and said, "We know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. But by what means he now sees, we don't know. Or who opened his eyes, we don't know. He's of age. Ask him, and he will speak for himself." And notice what John records for us in the next verse, verse 22. His parents said these things because they feared the Jews. For the Jews had agreed already that if anyone confessed that he, Jesus, was the Christ, he would be put out of the synagogue. And therefore his parents said, "He is of age, ask him." His parents were blinded by fear. There is no doubt that his parents knew that he was born blind. And they readily confessed that fact to the Pharisees whenever they were questioned. Is this in fact your son? Right? They're trying to put doubt. They're trying to put pressure on his parents so that they would come out with, no, he really wasn't born blind. This is all a scheme. We're sorry, and to walk away from it. But they confessed the fact that, yes, their son was blind and he was born that way. But whenever they're pressured with how he received sight, their answer is, we don't know. We don't know how he received sight. We don't know who did this to him. You need to talk to him. It's often the case, right, that parents would do anything to protect their children. But here we see that his parents are so fearful of the Pharisees that they don't want to give an answer. They don't want to say that we know he came to us and said this man Jesus, who he says is a prophet, is one who did this. They just blank it out and say, you go talk to him. We have no idea. We don't want anything to do with it. We're stepping back out of the way. You go talk to him, because they did not want to get kicked out of the synagogue. They did not want to get shunned. And we see very similar this idea all the way back in the book of Ezra. In Ezra chapter 10 and verse 8, there was this idea that if the whole congregation did not come and gather at Jerusalem, and they weren't there within 3 days, then they would sell all their property and they would be removed, banished from the assembly. They would be treated like a leper, shunned. It's perhaps the same reason that Nicodemus came to Jesus at night in John chapter 3 and verse 2. It's perhaps the same thing that we see in John chapter 12 and verse 42, and it says, nevertheless, among the chief rulers also many believed on Jesus, but because of the Pharisees they did not confess him, lest they would be put out of the synagogue. They were the Gestapo. They were the mob. People were afraid of the Pharisees. They didn't want to tell them the truth. And so his parents were blinded with fear. They did not want to confess that they knew it was Jesus that healed him. They just stepped out of the picture due to fear. And of course, the last group we have that were blind were the Pharisees. They were blinding with fraud. There was no way that you could discount the miracle that happened. As soon as word got to the Pharisees that this happened, look at verse 16 of John chapter 9. They already made up their minds that this thing didn't happen. Verse 16, therefore some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God. We're not even going to question who this man was that healed the blind man. Right? As soon as word got to them that this man received his sight, they've already made the determination that this isn't from God. This has to be from some other source. Not from God, because he does not keep the Sabbath. And of course there was a division. How can a man who is a sinner do such signs? And so there was a division among them. But they ignored the miracle. They disbelieved the facts that were presented to them. This man who everybody in town knew was born blind, who sat there and begged, can now see. They did not want to believe it. They knew the Scriptures. They knew the Scriptures, and they knew that it was prophesied that the Messiah was going to come and was going to give sight to the blind. Isaiah chapter 35 and verse 5. And they knew Psalm 148 and verse 6, that it is Jehovah opens the eyes of the blind. But they didn't want to hear it. They didn't want to see it. They did not want to give up their prestige and their power and to acknowledge that Jesus is deity. And their only hope was that to show that this perhaps was some conspiracy, verse 18, to convince the parents to say, no, he really wasn't blind. He wasn't born that way. They pressured. They tried to persuade others by using pressure. No, this didn't happen that way. They tried to give punishment, verse 22. Right? If you say this is Messiah and you say this thing actually happened, then you're going to be kicked out of the synagogue. Verse 24, they try to use coercion. After his parents say that, yeah, he was born blind, we don't know how he can see, they go again to the blind man. Verse 24, and so again they called the man who was blind, and they said to him, give glory to God. They're trying to give him an out. Use coercion, right? Give him an out so that he can just say, yes, it was God. It really wasn't this man. We know that this man is a sinner. In verse 34, they absolutely dismiss this man. There's no doubt that he was born blind. There's no doubt that now he can see. And so they can't answer him for how this happened without the obvious fact that Jesus is deity. And so they start attacking him as a person. Ad hominem. It is the favorite attack upon, I think, all Christians or any keyboard warriors, right? We're not going to attack the argument because we can't get around the argument that God exists, and so we're just going to attack the person. Verse 34. And so they answered the blind man and said to him, you are completely born in sin, and you're trying to teach us? And they cast him out. This man was born blind, and he was unfamiliar with Jesus. His parents were blinded with fear, and these Pharisees were blinding with fraud, blinding other people as well. Anytime we come in contact with other people and we try to share the gospel with them, we might come against some of these types of hearts. And hopefully it's with people who are blind with unfamiliarity. People who really don't know the truth of the gospel, or people who don't know really that God exists, and we have to take time to try to teach them. We think about Acts chapter 8 with Philip and the eunuch. Right? This man is sitting in his chariot, Acts chapter 8, verse 30 and 31, and he's reading from the scroll of Isaiah. And we understand that from whenever he quotes from there, Isaiah chapter 53, talking about the Messiah. And as he reads that, Philip asks him, do you understand what you're reading? And he says, how can I unless somebody teach me? There's a whole world of people out there who are just simply unfamiliar with the Scriptures, who are unfamiliar with what Jesus did on the cross to save their souls. They're unfamiliar with what's going to happen to them after death. And we have a responsibility to share that gospel with them, to try to teach them and try to train them and try to bring them to a knowledge of Jesus and the salvation that He offers. It's the same idea that Paul has in Romans chapter 10, starting at verse 14. How shall they call upon Jesus? How are they going to know? How are they going to believe? How are they going to believe in somebody they have not heard? And how are they going to hear without preaching, without proclaiming? People who are blind with unfamiliarity. There are going to be people that we come in contact with as we try to share the gospel who are blind with the fear. Why are they going to be afraid of the gospel? Well, perhaps it might mean separation from them and from their families. We think about what Jesus taught in Matthew chapter 10, 34 through 39. That He didn't come to bring peace but a sword. That because of following Jesus, there might be division that happens within a family. But we also need to understand that we need to fear more the one who can kill both the body and the soul in hell, instead of just the one who can kill the body. There are going to be people who fear to accept the gospel of Christ, because if I accept the gospel of Christ, and if I myself am baptized, and what's that mean for my parents? What's that mean for my grandparents? What's that mean for my spouse who isn't a Christian? Do I condemn them to be lost because I obey the gospel of Christ? There's going to be people who are afraid to obey the gospel of Christ. But we need to do our due diligence to teach them the truth of the Word. There's going to be people that we come across that are going to be just like these Pharisees, who are blind with fraud. They don't want to hear the truth. They don't care about the truth. And they want to try to destroy everything there is about Christianity so that nobody comes to them. We think about verses like what Paul writes to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 16 to shun profane and idle babblings. 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 and verse 6 to withdraw from every brother who walks disorderly. There are going to be people who don't care about the truth. And it's going to be disheartening whenever we try to share the gospel with them, when we try to bring correction to them in their lives, and they don't want to hear it. 1 Timothy chapter 6, starting in verse 3, Paul goes through a list of the hearts of these kind of people who are proud. People who know nothing, people who are obsessed with disputes, people who are obsessed with arguments over words, people who come with envy and strife and revilings and evil suspicions. And Paul says, from those people withdraw. Sometimes we think about that idea that, right, we're throwing our pearls before the swine. People who just want to argue. Paul dealt with those kind of people when he was going around on his missionary journeys. People who just wanted to hear what he had to say again the next day. Because it was some interesting words, but not really desiring the gospel of Christ. But there are those people who do. There are those people that are just blind because they just don't know. And we need to share the gospel with them. Are you here tonight and one of these apply to you? I hope it's not that you're here tonight and you're blind with fraud. I don't think you would be here tonight on New Year's Eve if you were in that situation. And I don't think you would be here tonight if you were blind with fear, right? Afraid of coming to obey the gospel of Christ. But maybe you're here and you just don't know your situation. Maybe you're here and you don't really understand that because you've not obeyed the gospel of Christ, that if you would die tonight, or if Christ would come back this very minute, that for all eternity, our soul would be lost in hell because I've not obeyed the gospel of Christ, or because of some sin in my life that I've not repented of. Don't let that be the case. I understand your situation. I understand that if your heart is not right with God, to make it right. Maybe that's obeying the gospel of Christ. Maybe that's believing that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. Maybe that's needing to turn away from sin. Maybe that is needing to be baptized, to have your sins washed away, to come up from that water grave as a new creation. And being obedient every day from that moment. Maybe it's needing to confess wrong and to come back to Him. Don't let the opportunity of the invitation of the Lord to escape you tonight as together we stand and as we sing.